Thank you. So we, in a way, resume the discussion we yesterday had in our practical session where we looked at different frequencies and we said just finding out that something is more common in one part of the corpus than in another, or in Indian English and Sri Lankan English, that as such is not so very exciting. We have to calculate the frequencies. We have to look at how big the corpus actually is. And so what I would like to do today is give a short introduction to some basic concepts in what you call descriptive statistics, not the more advanced inferential statistics, but you can get a long way just by calculating frequencies, relative and normalized frequencies. Inferential statistics is used when you, for example, want to weigh the impact of different factors. For example, you have a database, you find out that some feature occurs with such and such frequency with women of a specific age from a specific region, and then there are statistical tools called regression analysis which let you find out which of these factors, age, gender and region, is the most important one. But this is too much for 1 hour. So what I'm trying to do is to make this more lively, because not everybody is numerically unchallenged, I think. I have to admit my first brush with statistics was the book Statistics for Dummies. That will help me a lot. I can recommend that. And I'm using my own example in order to show what kind of data or what kind of frequency counts you need in order to make observations or in order to make empirical observations. So again, some guiding questions for discussion in order to wrap up the session. I quite liked what we did right now, so I thought that makes it more lively and more relevant for you. So what do these frequencies tell us? What do they tell us about current language use, and what do they tell us about language change in progress? Or is it just number crunching? Are the features that linguists like me are looking at, are they relevant at all? You may ask yourself that when you're a teacher, so how much of what we are talking about is so far removed from my daily life that I will never be able to use it? And if you say, I don't need it, that's fine with me. I can live with that. And then, again, a question which we have already touched upon in our last discussion is, so what is the relationship of the spoken language and the written language to the standard? So I have my pet hypothesis that something has to enter the written language first before it may be eligible for the standard, but this doesn't mean that everything that is in the written language is the standard and the other way around. A standard is more or less inevitable in a language, but what should go into it and how does this come about? So these would be the guiding questions which come up again at the end of the session for you to discuss and form an opinion about. Okay, I think the MA students already know my interest in YAR. I wrote a paper once about discourse markers in Singapore English and Indian English, and the one I focused on was YAR in Indian English. I think my original interest came from the film Rang de Basanti, where YAR was in a way a marker of being a cool young student, so it occurred there. And what I did, or this would be a kind of an outline. How do you go about this kind of study? What is your working assumptions? What are the steps in doing that? So for YAR, I use the ICE India corpus, all of it. First of all, you have to identify relevant examples. You can do this with this kind of concordance software that we had yesterday. So you type in YAR, and this is an easy example because there's only one spelling for YAR, like this, only one example, easy. So makes your life easy. First of all, you get all the relevant examples in your concordance, and once you have that, you look at these concordance lines and try to find out, is there anything specific about the meaning in context? Are there any peculiarities in terms of meaning, in terms of the syntactic context? This might also be interesting. Then you calculate your frequencies. You get your absolute frequencies, and I will tell you what relative and normalized frequencies are with the help of an example. And then you will probably come up against some kind of differences in frequency in some way or the other. And then you ask yourself, now, is that something interesting? Can I explain that? How can I explain that? Can I generalize that? Can I compare that with other varieties of English? YAR is not found in other varieties of English. So something very typical Indian English. So how did I do that? First of all, some examples. And as I said, in ICE India, you also get what you call metadata. So you know for each and every person who is contributing to the spoken part, what is her gender, what is the age, and so on, what is the education. So for me, it was interesting to find, since I was told YAR is a Hindi word which means male body originally, that you find it in all female conversations, which for me, or in general for linguists, is an indicator that it is losing its original lexical meaning and it's becoming more abstract. It's getting a kind of general discourse marker meaning. We say the original meaning is bleached. And interestingly, we have a similar word in German, Alter, which means old man. And we can use it, for example, as an exclamation when we are very excited. We say, Alter. So, and again, this has lost its lexical meaning. This is a common process that features change their meaning or lose the lexical meaning and get a more general meaning. And so here we have an example for all female conversations. Hey, Aruna, you're wearing a lovely shirt. YAR, where you got it from? And probably YAR doesn't mean male body when some woman talks to the next one. And then, I mean, here you have this use of man. It probably also doesn't mean man, but an exclamation. Man, you should see place, YAR, it's so dirty and all the time. Again, in an all-female conversation. Everybody has freedom of speech, YAR. This, again, is an example which is interesting because this is, you could say these two are directed at somebody. Here somebody is talking to somebody called Aruna. So you could say there's still some reference to another person. But here this is a very general statement. So YAR is not referring to anybody. So again, the context is becoming more and more abstract. So when you want to start an analysis like this, it makes sense to describe what you find. And for that, the corpus examples and the context are very, very helpful. So we have established it has lost most of its lexical meaning. Now we try to look at meaning and also the syntactic context, because it might make a difference. For example, does YAR always occur at the end? So this would be the end of a phrase. Here's an international break. Here you have it also at the end with an international break. Here you have it in the middle. So does that make a difference? And so I looked at the context, and I found overall, I only found 127 examples. So these are the absolute figures. We're going to look at the other ratios in a second. And most of the time, it does occur clause final. But it also occurs interclausal, but the most dominant part or the dominant position is clause final. And then when I looked at the pragmatic context, in what kind of speech act does it occur, I found that the majority of instances occurs in declaratives or affirmative statements. But then it's slightly mixed. It also occurs in interrogatives, in imperatives, in exclamations. And only once did it actually occur in its original lexical meaning. So when somebody said, this is my YAR. And then I could see, well, here it really means male body. And in all other instances, it has this more abstract meaning. So these are the absolute age level. So this is something I could find out from the corpus itself, but then I also asked friends. I said, when do you use Jahr? Do you use it with your parents? No, no, no. Well, that was a couple of years ago. This might have changed. But at the time when I was writing this paper, this was a very typical use, like in an in-group conversation among friends who know each other very well. Gender did not play a role. And so again, it only occurs in the spoken part. It does not occur in the written part. We can try that out later on the Globi corpus, whether you find Jahr in the blogs. So a blog as an informal kind of writing, and I can show you, or you can trust me, it does occur in blog. So at least it hasn't died out. It's still around. So the frequency is low, and we can make that statement that the frequency is low slightly more precise in a second. And what is also interesting, this is something that you call dispersion. It's not distributed evenly. So we have 100 files or 100 recorded dialogues, and it occurs only in 22 of them. So that means some people are using it a lot and some people aren't using it at all, which is an indication that it's not part of everybody's vocabulary. So if I want to claim this is typically Indian English, I can't say that. This is a minority use. It's interesting for me as a linguist, but it's a minority use. And if we now look at the frequencies, as I said, I have 127 instances. This is what you call the absolute frequency. If you want to compare that with other corpora, you have to set that into a relationship with how big the corpus actually is. So this would be the normalized frequency. But I also, since I said there's a difference perhaps between men and women, it's also used frequently in all-female conversation, you might want to calculate something like the relative frequency. And I did that. This would be one instance. For example, I looked at all the Jahr tokens by women, so I counted that separately. So out of these 127 tokens overall, 80 are used by women. And if you divide that, these 80 by 127, by the overall number of tokens, and multiply it with hundreds, then you get the percentage, and you find out that almost 63% of all these tokens are used by women. So it's interestingly more typical of women than of men. This is what you call relative frequency. You can also do this relative frequency. Let's say you have let's say we make recordings, we find out that people say no, na, and isn't it as tags. And you can say take the whole number of all tags, and then you want to calculate what is more frequent. Is it no, is it na, or is it isn't it? And then you can put that here, divided by the whole number of tags in general, and say this one is the most frequently used. This is the relative frequency. And then, of course, in order to normalize that, in order to make it comparable across corpora of different sizes, you need the normalized frequency. And you can calculate that some people do it per million words or per 10,000 words. It doesn't really matter. It's just in order that you have a measure of comparison. And in this instance, this would be you take the instances of what you found, these 127 Jahrs, and then you divide it in the number of words in this corpus, or I call it here a subcorpus because I only use the number of words in the spoken direct conversation part. And this is the kind of information, how big is the corpus. Sometimes it's provided in the corpus manual. We said that the ICE corpora are in general 1 million words, and the subcorpora, the spoken part, is around 200,000, but you want the exact figure. This is either supplied in the manual, or also if you use AND-CONC, the program, this will also count the words for you. So you take the number of instances of that particular feature you found, in this case Jahr with 127, divide it by the number of words in the corpus, and then you multiply it with 1 million, and then it turns out you have 58 instances of Jahr per million words. This is what is called the normalized figure, and this is what you need for comparison. So what we did yesterday, finding luck in Indian English in the sample corpus and in the Sri Lankan sample corpus, we had a big difference, but we can't work with that. We would then have to calculate the normalized frequencies of these to see how big the difference actually is. So this is very, very simple, basic set of descriptive statistics. What you could also do is analyze the significance. This one frequently used measure of analyzing significance is called the chi-square test. And this is described in this excerpt from the Corpuslinguistic books in your reader. This also makes recommendation of how to do that automatically with the help of an Excel spreadsheet. But there are also many chi-square calculators around on the net where you put in your figures and then they calculate it automatically for you. Because it might be the case that you have a difference, but this difference is more or less by accident. It's not really significant. So before you continue from that kind of reasoning, you should check whether your result is significant. For ICE India, we are fortunate that we have the speaker data. As I said, the metadata includes information about the speaker, so you can correlate what I already found about YA with who says it. And this is adding the sociolinguistic perspectives. What we know about sociolinguistics, that it's frequently women who are the linguistic innovators. So many studies have confirmed that, originally done by William Labov, but studies even outside of industrialized societies have confirmed that. So unless there's a big gap in education between men and women, for example, there are some studies of countries where women have not the same access to education than men, but in many societies, women are the linguistic innovators. So if I find a pattern that something is used by women more than men, I can form the hypothesis that this may be language change from below. I cannot say for sure because I would have to wait 20 years, but I can venture this hypothesis. So when I now look at this, and this is done then, of course, with Excel. So what we have here, we look at the gender of the different speakers. So this is the distribution of gender in the overall corpus. So you have here fewer males and more females who actually contribute as speakers. And then I can compare that with who says what. You see, we already said the majority of instances of YA come from women. And the difference here between YA tokens from men and from women is larger than the actual difference between men and women in the corpus. So I could say, yeah, women are significantly using YA more than men. It's not an either-or option, but it's a majority. So you could say women are in that respect more progressive than men with respect to this particular feature. Keep in mind, we are talking about a small feature, low frequency, which is not spread evenly across the population. But since I did this in 2007, I think I already at least have anecdotal evidence that YA is still around and still spreading. And when we look at age, it becomes even more interesting. You see YA, this is the overall, the blue is how the age groups are distributed in the corpus, and you see YA is very much a feature of younger people in the age group 18 to 25. You see 26 to 33, there's almost balance, and then it goes down. So it's a feature of the younger generation. And from what we know about sociolinguistics, you would say it's typical, predominant with young women. And if you did inferential statistics, you could also find out what is the most important feature, being young or being a woman. But just by looking at this kind of statistics, you see this is a predominantly female young feature. So we might, to repeat it, speculate that this is language change from below, and we need to see what happens to that. We don't have a new corpus of Indian English. If we replicated that, we might find more instances or less. It might have been gone, but I don't think so. But then we would really need a new study to see what happened to that. Another, coming back to the discourse markers known now, this is again, I took the same set of statistics, but I looked at the different distributions. I also considered spoken and written language. For Yara said it's only found in the spoken language anyway. So there's practically not eligible for standard language. So and then you can also say, well, it might probably not move into the written language because it's so typically interactional. Doesn't mean it's slang, it's just colloquial. And when you look at the discourse marker no na, I mean, there are again some examples. My father-in-law is suspended, you know that now. And it also, again, it typically occurs at the end of a sentence, but not always. Another example, I feel like to go to Kashmir for, again, somebody couldn't understand what was said here. Kashmir in Switzerland is same now. So here you're asking for confirmation. This is an example where somebody really didn't know, so this is asking for information. And you can, if you look at this example in context, you can distinguish the meaning. So here, this person really didn't know. And here you're asking for confirmation in the sense, you know that, and please tell me I'm right. So this is a very typical function of, interaction function of keeping up the discussion. And this, we've discussed that already, and you all feel there's a necessity for making a communication more intimate or more social to begin with. And when we now look at the frequency here, this means per million words. So I've already done the normalized frequencies per million words, and I looked at how na occurs. And you can see here, this is in the section of the private dialogue, and the overwhelming majority of tokens occur in private dialogue. Public dialogue would be something like discussions broadcasted or interviews or something like that, so which is not scripted. So it's spontaneous, but public in the sense, I think you pay more attention to your language when you're on the radio. And then monologue would be, for example, a sports commentator, for a cricket match. Again, this would be non-scripted. And written language, this includes everything from student essays to printed books. So there's a huge category, and you see the evidence is quite clear. Na is very, very typical feature of spoken, direct, informal communication. So what does this tell me? And I think these examples of no na, I mean, 2 per 1 million words, it's really very, very low number. It's almost non-existent. And as far as I remember, these are examples, I think, from novels where somebody imitated or somebody wrote down spoken language. On the one hand, this is something I would expect. As I said, this is the typical function of na is interaction. You ask something for confirmation, you elicit a positive response, and you don't do that in the written language. Because the written language is removed from the immediate context, you can't really ask for immediate response. There are other ways of doing that in the written language. And so what I would speculate is, since it's so predominantly spoken, it will probably stay there. But I also found, since I counted, I took all discourse or all invariant text into account, so the canonical questions like wouldn't you, couldn't you, and something like that, and the invariant isn't it, but the no-na is so much more frequent. I think I found something like 18 instances of, in absolute figures, of the canonical tag questions and more than 400 of the no-na. And please keep in mind, this is a corpus of highly educated speakers. So it's much more frequent. And then I could also check with the kind of data I had that it's used by speakers of all background language. This is why I'm so interested when you say da. Da wasn't in the corpus. So it didn't really matter whether somebody speaks Tamil as a first language or Maithili. No difference in that. And the education of the speakers, you could also check that. It didn't really make a significant difference. So it was undergraduates, masters, PhDs. They all used it in their conversation. So you would say this is typically Indian, it's used all across the country, but it's typically spoken Indian. And I'm also very interested in saying that right might be a new candidate, a new kid on the block in the terms of invariant tags. So this is the way how you can back up your observations with studies of frequencies and studies of distribution, looking at who says what, and also looking at, is it spoken, is it written, if you have the resource. And as I said, we have the spoken, we are very fortunate in having a corpus of spoken Indian English. For Sri Lankan English, we only have the written part and no spoken data yet. I'm really dying to get my hands on that, but I think they had to stop working on that for lack of funding. The data is all there, the data are all there, but somebody has to just transcribe it. And just again, guiding questions for discussion, or before we come to that, I also investigated only on and itself. He speaks like that only. I think this is also a stereotypical feature. And I found, to repeat, that only is very, very common in the spoken language, much more common than itself, but not found in the written language. Whereas itself, we meet here itself, is much rarer overall, but you also find that in writing. So you could say this feature itself is a very Indian feature, but it has crossed the threshold to the written language. And as such, it may or may not become part of an Indian English standard. We don't know that yet. But I've seen it so often in writing that it may become part of one. So this was a very, very brief and very restricted overview of the basic kind of descriptive statistic that everybody needs in order to make meaningful statements about corpus project, but it gets you quite far. If you do a combination of qualitative analysis, meaning you look at the context, what can you infer from the meaning, you look at the position of a specific feature, what does this tell you, and then when you quantify your results in terms of relative and normalized frequencies, this gets you a long way in positioning a feature in terms of its importance and significance within the speech of that particular community. And only if you have these kind of data, then you can compare it to other varieties. So then I would like to repeat these guiding questions for discussion. So what do these frequencies tell us about current language use? There's always a discussion, well, what does this mean for me as a speaker? And I've already said, in terms of sociolinguistics, if we find something with particular frequency with younger women, then we project or speculate that there might be language change in progress, but we cannot be sure. I don't know what your experience is in that. So what do these frequencies tell us? And then I've already hinted at that my particular interest is, I'm interested in, will there be a standard written Indian English? And what is the relationship of this standard to what goes on in the spoken language and what goes on in the written language? This brings us back to this discussion we had on the very first day in terms of post-colonial Englishes. Is there a tendency towards endonormative stabilization at all? So in a way, this links up to what we've already been saying. But I don't think it's we've finished that discussion conclusively in the end. So these are the questions I would like to leave you with and give you some more time for discussion, because I think we had a very fruitful discussion before the break. So please go ahead. Yeah, thank you very much. You were pointing out an important factor. So when you say what is a word of English, so many words start out their life as code switches, and sooner or later they become borrowings, and then you're not even aware that the fact that they're used to belong to some other language group to begin with. And this is a process specifically with words we can also document with online corpora. So not necessarily with the balanced corpora. This is something we will exercise later on and look at online corpora. How can you, in a way, document what's happening to words? Words sooner or later we had this example you gave me, this get integrated into the morphosyntactic patterns of the receiving language. And they will sooner or later also change their pronunciation. So words come and go from one language to the next and the other way around. So you can look at what you said, the words which are originally of Indian origin in English and the other way around. Thank you. Good point. Yes, please.
You can say that the frequencies will give further insights about language variables. And when it comes to a place like India with many cultures, it would give cultural variables about words, how they are used according to gender, age, and many other factors, like when we talk about the relationship between speaker and the receiver. Going to the second point about language change in progress, actually we can understand to which extent the language is changing in each aspect of language. I mean, here we can consider the social factors, and we can also talk about regional factors. With the second point or the second question, we can say that written language usually more related to standard, but they are not equal. And the reason is spoken language, because many words step by step will come into the dictionary of written or standard language. And like the example when we talked about yar, even if it was only 2%, but at least some people using this in their essays or their books. That's important.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's an important point that, I mean, the standard is fixed in a sense, but it's not fixed forever. We've seen that yesterday when we talked about the book by Christian Meyer, Change in 20th Century English, who was investigating the written language on the basis of these two corpora, which were 30 years apart, and he already found changes. Not massive changes, not massive qualitative changes, but certain quantitative changes. And you will find, if you go back to a book which is 100 years old, that you will feel it's 100 years old. It's still the standard, but the standard or your preferred way of saying something has changed somehow. Not that the grammar has changed drastically, but the way we express ourselves. You cannot capture it as much as you can say, well, there's a definite change from Shakespeare to today. There are grammatical changes in that. But somehow the way we express ourselves, and you could say these are perhaps pragmatic preferences, they will have changed. So even though the standard is fixed and is supposed to be fixed, something happens in our lifetimes, I think. Thank you very much. I think we are now finished with the one part of the session, and we're now moving to the computer lab again. Is that right? Yeah? Okay, so we will all hopefully find it again.